Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's Firelight Chat. I'm talking to author Nancy MacLean. She wrote a very important book, something that gives a stunning insight to how we got to where we got in this country. That book is called Democracy in Chains. Nancy is an award-winning scholar and professor of history and public policy at Duke University. Her research focuses on race, gender, labor history, and social movements in the 20th century U.S. history, with particular attention to the U.S. South. Her work has received more than a dozen prizes and awards. It's been supported by fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Humanities Center, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowships Foundation. Her books include Behind the Mask of Chivalry, The Making of the Second Ku Klux Klan, that came out in 1995, and Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America, that came out in 2017. And now there is an updated version in which Nancy has included some of the chapters of our history that have unfolded more recently since 2017. So we're very fortunate to get to hear from her today. And I want to ask Nancy, how did we get here? And the implication, of course, is what do we do now? Thanks. Nancy MacLean, thank you so much for being with me on Firelight Chat. It's great to see you again.
It's wonderful to be with you. Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you. When your book, Democracy in Chains, came out, I remember being kind of stunned by it. That was what, in 2017 that book came out?
It was, yes.
Yeah. So at that time, it was like radical new information. And now there has been, I think, a gradual awakening among the American people so that now you are the primary articulator of a conversation that more and more people are open to. I remember when I first read the book, basically what we're talking about here is how did we get here? What
Yeah.
was the actual systematic strategy that really caused such a movement of the Overton window in a rightward direction in the United States? I remember reading about the economist named Buchanan and all of the things that you write about in that book. So really, I'd like to just kind of throw it over to you. What happened and how is it that our democracy got put in chains?
Yeah, it's so sad. I so wish I'd been wrong, quite frankly. And my editor says, it's kind of strange for a history book to be predictive, but that's the situation that we're in. But the reason that it was predictive of how bad things have gotten was that it is the story of the deep strategy that has developed over time on the radical right, particularly the radical corporate right, led by the Koch network of donors assembled by Charles Koch over the years and with increasing velocity after 2009. But my story actually began in the 1950s in Virginia with the phenomenon of massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education. And in the course of looking at that and the push towards school privatization that came from the arch segregationists, I found that there was an economist getting involved with the segregationists and providing them a kind of a neutral economic rationale for what they were doing. And I became fascinated, wondering how anybody could do this, especially, someone who was cosmopolitan and, a professor and, spoke five languages. And why would somebody do that? Anyway, fast forward, what I found, going through this James Buchanan's archives and then connecting them with what was unfolding in the world around me from 2011 on, is that Buchanan developed the strategy that that has been implemented by the literally hundreds of organizations that the Koch donor network funds. And it is a strategy that is basically designed to, and here I'm not joking, I'm not exaggerating, reverse engineer the 20th century to try to make it so that all of the popular policies that came into effect, they particularly point, by the way, to women's suffrage as undermining their model of a good economy as being one of the contributors to that. But basically all the kind of popular policies that developed in the 20th century, everything from consumer protection to the unemployment compensation programs that we have, to regulation of corporate pollution and things like Social Security, Medicare, all of these things, these people are against, but they understand that these policies are very popular with the people and the voters. So what their strategy aims to do is to systematically demolish popular power, particularly, but not only, groups like unions, also Planned Parenthood, other groups like that, demolish that collective popular power, and then at the same time re-engineer the political system so that their ideas and goals have a better chance to prevail through things like voter suppression, gerrymandering, the weaponization of our federal system to empower states against the federal government. And of course, the ultimate part of, well, not the ultimate, sadly, the penultimate part of their strategy is court capture and changing the way the Constitution has been understood. And we absolutely see that with the current Supreme Court and all of the unpopular decisions it is inflicting on the American people that are taking away our freedoms, from reproductive freedom, to college access, to, again, environmental protection, and so much more. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the story that I was tracking.
So I remember when I first read the book, Buchanan was just this economist. I remember ultimately he even won a Nobel Prize, right? At the time, it was about the 1960s, right? That he was working.
Well, he was setting to work he went to Virginia in 1956 and then was very active, as a scholar, also secretly connecting with corporations and
Yeah.
right-wing political leaders in the 1960s. But he won the Nobel Prize in 1986.
So I remember reading a kind of chilling sentence in your book, something about how he said that in order to ensure the primacy of property rights, we would have to put democracy in chains. And that's where the title of your book comes from, right?
Yeah, he actually spoke of, in his terms, enchaining the Leviathan, which is how they referred to government. But he
The will
also,
of the people. Wait a minute. Well, hold on. So is the Leviathan, in their mind, the government, or in fact, is it not the will of the people?
it is the will of the people enacted by modern governments. And Buchanan actually did use a phrase in the early 2000s to say, why would anyone expect, in his view, sound economics to prevail after the 18, after the, as he put it, after the demos had been unchained. And for a
Okay, so
man who
hold on.
was
Let's go a little
had
slower
some
here. This is fantastic. So hold on. After the demos has been unchained, which means the will
in
of the
Greek,
people prevails.
right,
And of course,
right,
Jefferson had said the only safe repository for power is in the hands of the people. So he's saying, how could you have sound economics if the people have their way? Because he's
yes.
talking about an economics that basically serves the property owner.
Yes, absolutely. It's what I think of as property supremacy. And it's not a coincidence that that property supremacy overlaps significantly with white supremacy.
Well, of course, going all the
Buchanan,
way back to the
yeah,
ownership of slaves. That's what that is, they're my
exactly,
property.
exactly.
And that is that
And
evil,
there's
the other.
very significant overlap between his ideas about government and where classes come from and the problems of tax transfers and the thinking of John C. Calhoun, the 19th century US Senator and former vice president, who ended up leading the militant South toward what became secession. But he was also a very sophisticated anti-democratic theorist, and Buchanan's ideas really overlap significantly with his, as even Buchanan's own students recognize.
So, where does Ronald Reagan come in?
Oh, yeah, interesting point. So Ronald Reagan, of course, was governor of California before he was president. He was deeply connected with the right in California, with, again, the kind of right that we see now, the kind of based in fossil fuels, industrial agriculture, a lot of industries that are dirty industries that have problematic consequences for their workers and for the public. And that was really the base of the political right in California. And Buchanan actually spent most of his career in the South and in Virginia institutions, but there was one little blip of a time when he left Virginia in a huff from the University of Virginia and went to UCLA. And he happened to be there when Angela Davis was teaching and drawing huge crowds, much to his discomfort. And he became connected with Ronald Reagan through that, and with Ed Meese, and actually laid out a program that the right is now following for how to undermine dissent in higher education by privatizing it, by raising tuition costs, by taking away faculty governance, all of these kinds of things. But in any event, so he got connected with Reagan, and particularly Ed Meese, Reagan's consigliere, that people may remember from Iran-Contra, anyway, and who is still a big actor on the right in his later years. But Reagan became a symbol, and he drew the attention of many people on the right, and he talked the kind of libertarian anti-government talk. Many of your listeners will probably remember his inaugural address when he said government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. But if you can imagine the kind of people that I'm writing about here, that I wrote about in Democracy in Chains, Buchanan and Charles Koch and all the kinds of operatives and others that they have, allied in this cause, they found Ronald Reagan to be a great disappointment because he was not right-wing enough. And then they found George W. Bush, who was, our most right-wing president. When he was in office, they found George Bush to be a disappointment. And in both cases, what they were angry about is that these figures, again, would kind of talk the talk of libertarianism, but they wanted to stay popular. So they wouldn't do things like privatize Social Security, privatize Medicare.
Bush talked about it. Hold on a second. Bush
did.
On a second. Now he did flirt with that, but he didn't get it. So he walked it back.
Yes.
Now I have been told though that the Koch forces do not like Trump.
It's kind of a complicated issue, and I mentioned earlier to you that I have a new edition coming out of the book later this month with a preface that kind of brings things up to date. But what I point out there is that even though Charles Koch in particular made noises against Trump before he was elected and described him as a monster, among other things, they very quickly kind of surrounded him when he was in office, and people from the Koch Network occupied key positions in the Trump administration. Most obviously, his vice president, Mike Pence, who was deeply rooted in the Koch Network operations, as well as Mark Meadows coming out of the Freedom Caucus, before him, Mark Short, Betsy DeVos. I mean, I could go on. There are dozens of these figures. And, essentially, one doesn't have to think that they prearranged this or anything, but they Koch and Trump very quickly realized the utility of the other for their projects, because Trump didn't really have a governing philosophy, a governing plan. He did not have people to staff his administration. He had angered many people, in the I hate to call it mainstream because it was already so far right, but in the established party. So when he, went looking for policies to promote, for advice and things like that, the Koch network was right there. And they got some of the things that were most important to them, like his immediate pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords. He revoked 100 pieces of environmental legislation. His administration did. They did that hideous tax bill that gave away, a bonanza to corporations and the wealthy, and the rest of us will be paying for years to come. And that's just some of it. I mean, there were so many things that they got from that administration, which they could never have gotten had they argued for those things in their own right, in a normally functioning political system.
So let me ask you a question. The Democrats had the White House, though, for 16 years. The Democrats had the White House with Bill Clinton and with Obama. Why were these forces able to keep marching as much as they did, even when we had Democratic presidents?
Yeah, really, really important question. I mean, part of it is that people haven't even really recognized that that's what they were dealing with, that this is what we were dealing with until recently, because they do like to fly under the radar. Koch at one point said that he'd learned from his father the expression that the whale that surfaces is the one that gets harpooned. So, they tried to stay, under the radar for as long as possible, and really only began to be noticed, around the time time that President Obama was elected. But I actually went back and did some research after the book for something else, but found out that it was the Koch Network operations, particularly a group then called Citizens for a Sound Economy, which convened all the organizing that undermined the healthcare plan that Hillary Clinton was championing in the Clinton years.
The Thelma and Louise
So when
had
she spoke,
I want to take a
sorry.
moment and make sure those of you who are young who might not remember, I want to make sure you know.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, Bill Clinton, along with his wife, who was head of the effort, really did try on universal health care. And the majority of Americans wanted it, and it was a very exciting moment. And then all of a sudden, there was this barrage of ads, and that's what
Yes.
Nancy is referring to. All of a sudden, they were called the Thelma and Louise ads at the time because there would be these two women sitting in their kitchen. I don't know. I'm just
Mhm.
worried because I want to keep my doctor. And they scared
Yeah.
everyone into thinking they couldn't keep their doctor. And it was really an example of what happens when you throw billions of dollars into an effort, man. You can kill whatever you want to kill
Yes.
on a political.
Exactly.
Nancy, do you think that what happened with the Clintons in terms of um, the rejection of universal health care is part of what made him go in the direction of the Democratic Leadership Council, feeling that the only way we could beat these guys is if we made as much money as they did? Do you think that's what caused Clinton to move in
Clinton,
that direction?
well, he actually came out of the Democratic Leadership Council, so he did try to square the circle, and Clinton, I mean, certainly he was battered by those efforts and then by the Republican Revolution, as it was called, of 1994 with Newt
Contract by
Gingrich and
contract.
Dick Armey. And like Obama, he was shellacked, in the midterm elections 2 years after he was elected, with low turnout of Democratic voters and such. But he also, Clinton came from Arkansas, a lot of this kind of this anti-government, states' rights kind of philosophy has always been anchored in the South because of slavery and the racial capitalism that developed thereafter. So Clinton, at that point, like Tony Blair in England and many other people, kind of imbibed these ultra market, anti kind of government ideas. So, I mean, he did try to do some things, but he also, he brought NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Alliance, that has done a great deal to undermine living standards and manufacturing, things like that. So Clinton was problematic in many ways as a president, in ways we see even more clearly with hindsight, and I think that's partly why Hillary Clinton aroused not that much enthusiasm among the many of the Democratic voters that she needed to reach to prevail in 2016, because she was seen as associated with those policies and with that presidency, and really didn't have an answer for people in places that had been deeply damaged by those so-called free trade policies. And so, and Obama, in some ways, I think also kind of drank some of that Kool-Aid, even though he tried to do different things. So so there have been challenges within the party. I think one of the things that we've seen since 2016 in particular is a kind of fight for the soul of the party. And I think it's very interesting that grassroots groups, community groups, or labor unions, immigrant rights groups, women's groups, environmental groups, so many people have actually push the current administration to the left on many of these issues in a way that is more so than under certainly under Clinton, and even under Obama, because the conditions in our society are so different and people are frustrated, understandably.
Well, I don't know. You've got four major environmental organizations that have endorsed Biden. Biden has given
Mhm.
more oil drilling permits even than Trump did. He has okayed the Willow Project. So, and when you look at some of the so-called progressives, even AOC having endorsed Biden this time, I don't know how you're pushing someone to the left when you're endorsing them right away when they are actually not standing for the things that you want. So I think this idea of the Biden leftward direction is kind of overstated, both in terms of what he has accomplished and also in terms of those who are supporting him. Certainly, if Build Back Better had passed, that would be a whole different thing. But there
Right.
are,
I was talking about, yeah, setting the
yeah,
agenda for the administration. And it is a challenge. I mean, we can forget now, but FDR had huge majorities in Congress. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, when he was, pushing for the civil rights legislation, voting rights, and the Great Society legislation of the 1960s, had a majority of like 60. Like he could lose a lot of people and still prevail. Biden came in, and I was talking about, his agenda coming into office, was much more progressive, I think, than these previous figures, but also had such tight margins with the filibuster in the Senate. There were only 60 Democratic
yeah,
senators,
yeah.
and
Also,
Joe Manchin and
yeah,
Kyrsten
yeah.
Sinema.
See, I have, there's so much making excuses for these Democrats. And Nancy, I have a problem with it. Go back to someone like Obama. Obama was elected with a mandate. We bought the whole hope and change thing. We
Mm-hmm.
did. And we gave him the White House, and we gave him the Senate, and we gave him the House. And you said something of a couple of minutes ago about how during the midterms 2010 Democrats
Mm-hmm.
didn't show up. I would argue that they didn't show up because he didn't go in there and do what he said he was going to do. So, I mean, sometimes it's about Democratic presidents being blocked, and sometimes it's about the Democratic presidents not doing what they said they would do and showing the spine once they got there. One thing you said about the Republicans is they
Mm-hmm.
consider winning the election their mandate. And Democratic presidents sometimes, it's like you were. I remember you were saying in our last interview that Clinton himself said about himself, "I'm an Eisenhower Republican."
Yeah.
Didn't you
Yeah.
tell me that? So, Nancy,
I may somebody else might have, but I certainly know that
okay,
he's thought
right.
that the political system in the U.S. had shifted so far to the right. I will say though, there's another interesting piece here, and that is that for many, many, many years in this country, we had essentially two different electorates: the presidential electorate, because most Americans tend to focus on the person at the top of the ticket, and personality questions, and then the midterm election electorate, and the midterm electorate has traditionally skewed older, whiter, and wealthier because and so many people don't even understand state politics. So much of this Koch style radical right revolution has been carried through at the state level in states like my North Carolina, because a lot of people don't even vote the whole ticket, right? They leave part of the ballot blank, and as a result Republicans get disproportionate power. But one of the things that we've seen that's been so interesting since Trump was elected in 2016 is that that's changing. And the midterm turnout of particularly young voters, Gen Z voters, has gone up. Also, women were outraged, at the Dobbs decision and turned out in significant numbers in 2022, along with young people who are concerned about, and young people, the data, the information that we have suggests are much more concerned about issues than about the personalities at the top of the ticket. So if the issues are reproductive freedom, protecting gay and trans people, trying to get action on the environment, like those are things that are very motivating to them. So that is one really encouraging development that we've seen in the last few years that
Well,
that I am hoping will continue.
Well, absolutely. This whole idea that, young people don't show up to vote and they don't show up to vote during the midterms, forget that, because young people are why the Democrats did keep the House in 2022. But let's remember they're voting for their lives. So I think the Democratic elite establishment is very naive if they think that all those young people are doing is rejecting the Republican right. They're also rejecting the neoliberal Democrats. If, on one hand, as you were saying, uh, anybody who'll stand up against, diminishing women's reproductive rights, anyone who'll stand up against the efforts to, to go after transgender. But also, they realize that the establishment neoliberal Democrats are not giving them universal health care, are not giving them tuition-free college and tech school, et cetera. So, my own
Well,
feeling is that for the Democrats to think all they have to do is not be the radical right is really kidding ourselves. And I don't think that that kind of view would be enough to win in 2024. Now, I want to ask you because
oh,
last
I
time,
absolutely think. Yeah, but I will say too, I'll just push back a little on this because I do think, on some of these issues, it has been a problem of, I mean, and I always want to see more than we get. So just to be clear about that, but, we have a very difficult, recalcitrant kind of political system. And I do think, the fact that the Supreme Court undermined the tuition relief that students were going to, young people were going to get from the Biden administration, they didn't stop trying to do that. They're trying to find other ways around that now that can be done, that can be within the way that the Constitution is being
Yeah,
interpreted
but
by the current courts. And
yes,
ditto,
that's true.
today I just saw something about renegotiating the leases on federal land, and it was astonishing to me to see that
Yeah,
since these
that's
things were
true.
created like more than a century ago, nobody has changed the royalties that fossil fuel companies pay for, drilling on federal lands and mining on federal lands, or the amount that they have to pay up front if they cause problems or things like that. So, that is another thing that's going through at the executive level, because it's impossible to get it through, Congress at this point. But I think, we have to watch all these things. Is one thing that I worry about as an educator with young people is honestly, and I hear this from people in all kinds of domains, like we have as a country dropped the ball in civic education, and a
Yeah,
lot of,
I'm
well,
sorry,
young
what?
people and older people on on civics, right, on understanding like how does an idea become a bill, become law. What is the authority, does what authority does a president have as an executive, what is the balance of things between states and federal government. And so there's a lot that people don't know, and particularly I think in the social media intensive, 24/7 media environment that we're in, we tend to, there's big dust ups often over things that are, how some person behaved or what they said. And what isn't getting attention is the kind of thing that investigative reporters, there, of which there used to be many, many more, would dig into and really, expose in terms of deep, structural problems or challenges or things that have been done right. But we're not getting a lot of that news, and we're getting a lot of noise. So I think the crisis of the media in the internet age is part of our problem, but like good news, as Sarah Kendzior said in one of her books, good news, like accurate fact-based investigative news, went behind paywalls at the same time that disinformation was being, put out by fire hoses for free. So there's just so many dimensions um, to the crisis that we're facing now, and it's hard to keep them all in view, but I think it's helpful.
Yeah, and Biden also did vote for the bill that said you couldn't go use a bankruptcy, you couldn't go bankrupt with the college loan debt and things like that. So I just have a sensitivity about making, always coming out with this
Mhm.
kind of codependent, making excuses for Democratic presidents. I hear what you're saying, but I think
Mhm.
also there are ways that even despite all the machinations of Washington, great leaders can cut through and make things happen, or at the very least, talk to the American people. Now, when you and I talked
Can I
before,
add one thing there, Marianne?
yeah,
I think this is apocryphal, but I have read in a number of places, though I've never seen it fully sourced, that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president for the young people, during the Depression, and was key factor in creating what we call the New Deal and kind of the modern federal government that meets our needs, even if imperfectly. But he is said to have told union people who came to see him, okay, well, make me do it. Make me give you the legislation that you want, right? And what he meant by that, and this, same thing has happened to civil rights activists, women's movement activists, environmentalists. There has to be independent social movement organizing on the ground to create the opening for significant policy change. And if we don't have that, then we don't get the policy change. So, like I would say too, at this moment, we've lost our anti-war. Like where are people who are worried about the size of the military budget, right? Other
I
than
don't
like
think
Bernie
that, you
Sanders is
know,
trying to chip it
they
down by
do
10%.
that to all the millions of people who worked so hard to elect Bernie Sanders, and the DNC suppressed his voice. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that too, because a lot of people would say that they tried so hard to do exactly the kinds of things you say the people need to do. It always comes down to, well, the people didn't make us do it. The people have tried so hard, and I think we need to deal
Mm,
now with how sclerotic the political system is, including among the Democrats, that sometimes makes it
mm,
so hard for the will of the people to really be effectuated. But going back, when you and I spoke before, this was before the update in your book. And I know now with this update, you're taking on the whole Trump phenomenon. How did, we understand, starting with the economist Buchanan, the primacy, that in
mm,
order to protect the primacy of property, we have to put democracy in chains. The Koch brothers said, we love that. We'll fund that. They started their whole strategy. You named many ways in which they effectuated that strategy, even unto the point of taking over the courts. You said that they didn't love Trump, but once Trump was in
mm,
office, he was sort of a useful idiot for them in a
mm,
way. Um,
mm.
Regardless the personality of Trump, where did the Trump presidency leave us, and where are
Mm.
we now in terms of the threat of this right wing
Yeah.
assault on the will of the people? Extreme right wing.
Yeah. The threat is, horrific, right? I mean, and it continues to unfold. And one of the, there are so many dimensions to this. I mean, fortunately, this is a good week for finally, grand juries and Trump and his associates in trying to steal the election and overthrow the will of the people. Finally, there is judicial accountability developing, with a number of the state suits as well as what's coming from the federal prosecutor Jack Smith. It looks like that is finally happening, and that's important because what we know from the political science literature, the comparative literature on coups, is that the best predictor of a successful coup is a failed coup for which there is not accountability, right? And that's where it looked
Well,
like we were
hold
headed,
on,
a few months
hold
back.
on. That's really, slow down a little, because what you just said was really
Right?
important. What you pointed to was the danger of not holding him, the danger that lies in not
Yes.
holding Trump accountable.
Hmm.
You said the predictor of the successful coup is an unsuccessful one for which there was no accountability. Wow.
Yep.
Well, Jack
Yep.
Smith's trying to take care of that now. So is Michigan. So states
Yeah. So
are
that is
trying to pick
encouraging.
it up. Of course, the problem we have, Nancy, is that there are people who would vote for Trump for president even if he's in jail.
I know. I know. I know. It's, whatever it is, a quarter of the country at least is, rock solid behind this. And, that reflects a number of things. I think one of them is that this radical right that I wrote about made a strategic decision, certainly by the 1990s, and that has accelerated since, to make an alliance with the religious right. And Catholics where they could get them, but absolutely white evangelicals, in particular. And if you think about it, what first motivated white evangelicals to begin to organize and develop an identity that crossed their denominations? It was the Scopes trial, right? It was teaching evolution in the schools. So here was an audience primed for the science denial that the fossil fuel magnates like Charles Koch and Exxon and Shell and all of these people have been spilling out. And they have actually funded the development of theology that would be pro-capitalist, and support this deadly industry. And I'm actually working on a book now that looks at the transnational version of all this, and I don't want to scare the hell out of your readers, but I see better now than I had when I wrote Democracy in Chains, that it really is the fossil fuel sector and dirty industries that have been in the vanguard of this radical corporate right, trying to evade action, trying to stop government regulation, trying to keep, profiting from their deadly products. And they actually started. They knew in 1959 how deadly their products would be, that they would be catastrophic. There was an industry briefing of the, executives from many of the top fossil fuel companies and the American Petroleum Institute. This is from a book called The Petroleum Papers, 1959. That's the year I was born. I'm 63. They've known about it for all of that time. And the news only got worse. Their own scientists were telling them, we're going to see catastrophic consequences from greenhouse gases, et cetera. What did they do? Did they stop to save the rest of us and the planet? No. They saw new sources of profit and they continued to invest, but they funded a vast denial apparatus and this political apparatus to paralyze government so that it couldn't act on climate change, but all these other things that the people want as well. And they are working transnationally, using these kinds of ideas that Buchanan and Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek and others developed. Anyway, it's quite something. It's breathtaking, but also I do want to emphasize that they're doing this because they know their agenda is not popular, right? That people would be horrified if they really understood, what climate, the catastrophe, will be, and if they knew where the rest of this apparatus was going in terms of, ending programs like Social Security and Medicare and public education that are very popular. So that, to my mind, is the key finding of my book, to see them saying over and over again that they knew that they were unpopular, that they knew they couldn't win if they were to argue openly for the kinds of policies they're pushing. And that's why they needed disinformation. That's why they need stealth. That's why they need to quash the proper representation of the electorate through things like voter suppression and gerrymandering. So that is terrifying, that there are people who would do that. But I think that is also should be encouragement to us to realize that we, if we can find our voices, if we organize, if we, push and we change and we reform these broken political systems, we may actually be able to get the action that we need on the things that most people care about.
Well, of course, a lot of people, particularly young people, say, well, how are we supposed to do that? If you have a president such as we have now, who's given more oil drilling permits than Trump did and is approving the Willow Project, obviously just voting for a Democrat is not necessarily the answer. It's got, and then you have to address the fissure within the Democratic Party. And of course, as someone who's running as a progressive, I recognize that the establishment elite corporatist Democrat, when it comes to things like military spending, when it comes to things like um, big oil, are as obeisant as are the Republicans these days to the corporate dominance of policy because of corporate donations. So I think that, it's so hard, Nancy, because you and I have an institutional memory of times in history when if you pushed hard enough, you could get there. But these kids today recognize the undertow moving in the right, particularly after the suppression twice of the candidacies of Bernie Sanders. So I see that this is a very, very significant moment, and God help us if we don't play it right, because if Trump gets back in, do you believe these stories that he already has plans underway for how he would take over more aspects of the government? Have you been reading those articles?
Yeah, I mean, and they're being reported by really excellent, experienced veteran investigative journalists like Maggie Haberman at the Washington Post. Yes, I do believe it. And Trump has been advised by people. I mean, his plan to overthrow the election came from someone who was the chair of the Federalist Society's. I forget exactly what the title of the commission was, but it was the Federalism and State Practices or something. So these are people who come from these organizations that I was writing about in Democracy in Chains. They are no friends of democracy. And what we've seen too, I was mentioning that my new work is about the global aspects of this, because if we there's so much to preoccupy us in our own country, but we're not the only country going through things like this, right?
Yeah,
I mean, Hungary
absolutely.
has an authoritarian government that
Absolutely.
the
And then
American
you
Republican
have
Party
people like Tucker
is not.
Carlson looking at Viktor Orban and saying, this is just great. There are
Yeah,
people in the
that's what we
Republican
want.
Party
Yes.
actually
And then there was
pointing.
Bolsonaro in Brazil, the
Yeah,
Brexit
they
vote,
love
and
him.
Yeah, but anyway, what I'm finding in this current research is that this thing called the Atlas Network, which the Koch Network has been investing in since its creation in 1981, their affiliates have been involved in all of these things. So I think that's what's happening with them is that they have become frustrated by the inability to make the kind of progress that the donors are now demanding, in as fast a way as they are seeking to get it. And so they are starting to look to these reactionary populist figures like Trump, like Bolsonaro, like Boris Johnson, like Viktor Orban. And by the way, Berlusconi was the first, but at that point we didn't understand, anything about this network or anything. But
Interesting.
they are seeing that if they get a figure like that, it is enough to distract the public, to create identity-based kind of tribal divisions among people, to kind of break up the way things normally happen, create what one of them wrote in the 1960s as a populist reset, pointing to Joe McCarthy as a good example, and use that kind of chaos in order to push through their agenda. And we see that now. They talk about, certain actors as what do they call them? Chaos agents. So
Hmm.
Steve Bannon talked about Joe Kennedy as a chaos agent, a useful chaos agent, in this election. So these are just such fraught times, but I think it's really incumbent on all of us to learn as much as we can about kind of what's going on behind the scenes, because once you see what the strategy is and what the end game is, you're in a much more empowered way to figure out, how to navigate it and how to think about how each of us, can make a contribution. And we all have different skills, different resources, different networks, we're placed in different parts of the country, but, there's something for everyone to do in this crisis. And again, once we see, kind of, it's almost like having X-ray vision. I think, once you have that X-ray vision, you're in a much better position to figure out how to spend your limited energies and resources, because of course people have chaos happening in their personal lives in these times too, when there's so much
Well,
less
well,
social
I think
support
also when you
for
said
families.
it's helpful to know what's really happening behind the scenes, I think your work, what has been so illuminating for me, is it's not just making it clear what's happening behind the scenes, but also making it clear how all this happened, to look at the history,
Yeah.
to see the trajectory. That to me is what just opens your eyes. And then you get it, and you get that they're simply being successful at what they set out to do a long time ago. And if Democrats are only reactive as opposed to proactive in
Mhm.
developing the kind of society we want, then there will be a
Yep.
limit to how much you can fight this stuff off. Because
Mhm.
um, there is a level on which it becomes almost perversely attractive to people who are looking for a strong man, and don't realize
Yeah.
that the strength comes from democracy itself. Nancy MacLean,
Yeah.
you're fantastic. Thank you very, very
Oh,
much.
thank you
And
so much. It's a
it's
pleasure to
wonderful
speak
to
with
have you.
you. And yes.
Thank you.
And
So remember, everybody, Democracy in Chains, there is now a new edition, which is the updated edition, because the original did not include the years of Donald Trump and so much of an update on what's going on now. And when it comes to all of this that we've been talking about today, as far as I'm concerned, there's nobody sharper than Nancy MacLean to tell us what's really going on, how it happened, and to give us really profound insight into what we as citizens need to do about it now.
thank you so
Nancy,
much, Marianne. And
thank
thank you to
you.
the listeners for taking these issues so seriously and trying to
So
find effective ways to act.
we all need to. Thank you so much.